Hey, I'm Alex Burkill.
And I'm Annie Shuttleworth, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024-25 storm naming list that has been released this week.
Is your name on the list? Have you seen the list yet? We will be having a little look at the names that are on it and a bit of a look as to why some of the names have been chosen coming up. But first, we wanted to look at storm naming as a whole. So first of all, Annie, please, can you tell us, why do we name storms?
We name storms to aid with the communication of severe weather, so it helps us to create a consistent message that we share with government partners and media to ensure that the general public are better prepared for the upcoming severe weather. And since we started the storm naming process in 2015, we have seen definitely an improvement in the awareness around severe weather.
Exactly. We know people take it on board. They're more likely to talk about the storm, both in the media, but also just to each other. They're more likely to bring it up. And so it's all about, like you say, increasing the awareness and so that people can make decisions to help keep them safe and just anything that might make things better before the unsettled weather. We can't stop the unsettled weather coming, but we can make people be better prepared. With that in mind, just looking back at Storm Babette, for example, a severe storm that came in October last year, and it brought some very heavy rain, and that led to some red warnings being issued as well as amber warnings. And we found that within the amber and red warnings, 97% of people were aware that a storm was coming, and 89% then took action. And so that is a significant number of people, and I don't think that number would have been anywhere near as high if we hadn't named it, because giving it a name meant we were able to get the message across.
Exactly, it gives people something to talk about across social media, and that's somewhere we share all of our severe weather information quite widely. We've seen a real uptake in people sharing what they're doing around warnings and upcoming severe weather. So someone said they told their mum to tie the trampoline down, something that often goes flying in stormy weather. There's often a lot of videos around on social media, but it's actually pretty dangerous. So it's really good that people have been doing something about it before it starts rolling down the street.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to be hit by a trampoline driving down the road or even walking down the road. So yes, make sure if you do have one and we have a storm coming that you'll want to tie it down like this person. The other quote that we had coming in from TikTok: planning how I'm going to keep my rabbits safe and downloading things on Netflix in case of a power cut. Yes, animals, rabbits, guinea pigs, any animals that live outdoors may be more at risk during periods of stormy weather. So this person taking our advice and making sure that their rabbit is safe. And yes, there could be power cuts.
Yeah, often with strong winds, trees come down on power lines. It's the main impact really, they come down on roads as well, causing big travel disruption. But power cuts is one of the major disruptions from storms that can last for quite a few days afterwards, because everything's got to be recovered. So downloading your Netflix, because you might be disconnected from Wi-Fi for a while, is a good idea.
Now these may seem like relatively small measures that people can take to prepare for a storm, but nonetheless there were some of the things that people were coming up with ahead of some of the storms last year.
Because storms can bring some pretty major impacts. So when is a storm named?
So like you say, it's all to do with the impacts. Our warnings are impact based, and when it comes to whether or not a storm will be named, it needs to at least have the potential to require an amber or red warning, if an amber or red warning hasn't already been issued. And our warnings all come down to those impacts. If I just get up our warnings matrix, which you may have seen before, and on the x-axis we have our impacts, on the y-axis our likelihood, and so you can have yellow warnings with medium impacts in this column here, and it's this column really that is the important one when it comes to storm naming. So if we have our medium impacts, regardless of the likelihood to some extent, medium or higher impacts, then that's when we could be looking at a named storm. So we may just have a yellow warning. Sometimes with some storms, Lillian for example, which we had recently, we only had yellow warnings, but because there was the potential that we could have had to escalate it up to an amber or a red warning, that's why we did actually name the feature. It's worth bearing in mind that it doesn't just have to be wind. There needs to be some sort of wind element for it to be classed as a storm, but the medium impacts could come from the wind, the rain, or from snow. For example, Storm Babette, that was chiefly a rain feature. It was the rain that caused the most disruption, but it also was very windy, and so that's why we had a named storm.
And it's worth noting that it's not just us that name our storms. There's other storm naming centres as well, and some of them base their naming on thresholds, don't they, rather than the actual impacts, such as Met Erin, the Irish Met Service. So sometimes a storm might be named by Met Erin. The impacts in the UK might not be quite as high or as great, but we'll still be going with that name.
Yes, you're right. Everyone does it slightly differently, but our warnings here at the Met Office are to do with impacts and likelihood, and that's how we come up with them. So the next question, Annie, how do we name our storms?
So once we've decided the storm naming criteria have been met, either the Met Office, Met Erin, the Irish Met Service, or KNMI, which is the meteorological organisation in the Netherlands, will take the next name off the list. It's an alphabetical list. It's pre-arranged. It's the list that we have already released this week, and they'll take the next name and give it that name and spread the news. Now, we spread that news across the media, across our government partners, and then to the general public to get everyone prepared and aware of the upcoming severe weather.
Yes, we should have mentioned, apologies, that it's the chief meteorologist here at the Met Office, whoever that is on shift at the time, who will work with our partners, our contingency advisors, to deem whether the impacts are going to be severe enough. So people will be aware already that we're potentially going to name a storm. It doesn't just come out of the blue, but like you say, then we start to push out the story.
Exactly, so it's something we generally build up to, and then when we've got enough confidence on the upcoming severe weather, we will name it and share it as quickly and as far and wide as we can. So that's our storm naming group. We're part of the Western European Storm Naming Group. That's the blue group you can see here. So it's Northern Ireland, the UK and the Netherlands. But there are other storm naming groups which can bring storms that affect us here in the UK. So as you can imagine, storms come in from the Atlantic often. So if they come in from the north, it might be the Northern European Storm Naming Group, which is Denmark, Sweden and Norway, or possibly coming in from the south and west, which is probably a more common one than the northern group, the southwestern group, which is Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium and Luxembourg.
Now, there are a couple of other storm naming groups around parts of Europe, but it's really those three, well, particularly the one that we're in, the Western group, that we're most likely to get the named storms affecting us in the UK. It's worth bearing in mind, we have our list, which we share with Met Erin and KNMI, and if it's any of us that name it, then we would go down our list to find the name of the storm. However, both the Southwestern group and the Northern group have their own separate lists, and even if they've already named the feature, even if we then decide that it is going to be stormy enough, the impact's high enough that in the UK it would warrant it being named, then we would adopt the name that it's already been given by one of the other groups. We wouldn't give it our own name just to keep things consistent. And similarly, in the same way, if we've already named a feature that is then going to affect France, for example, they would use our name rather than giving it the name on their list.
Exactly. Yeah, we want to keep a consistent and clear message so that it's not confusing, basically.
But should we have a little look at what happened in the last storm season?
Yeah.
You may remember it was a pretty stormy storm season. In fact, we got the furthest
stormiest,
along.
in fact.
Exactly.
But only since we started, which I said earlier was 2015. So it doesn't really stand across our records. But since we started the storm naming process, this year we've got the furthest down the list, all the way to L, than we have ever done before. Now, we started in September, so the storm season starts on the 1st of September, so it didn't take too long. 27th of September, we had Storm Agnes come through, and then Babette, which Alex already mentioned was a particularly notable storm of the last storm season. We had 2 red warnings, intense rainfall across northeastern Scotland in particular, red rainfall warnings that lasted over a few days. And then Ciarán, which brought strong winds and and intense rainfall as well. And then we had a number of storms named by Met Erin.
Yeah, so we've already mentioned that we share our list with KNMI and Met Erin, but actually Debbie was named by the Irish Met Service. It did actually bring some significant impacts to the UK. We had an amber warning for wind as well as a larger yellow one, but both then Ellen and Fergus, which actually came quite quickly one after the other. The impacts for the UK, it was a bit wet and windy in some parts, but it wasn't enough that we would have actually named it. But because Met Erin did, then we've kept that name, and that's why we've brought it on this list. Then came Gerrit, which came in that little period between Christmas and New Year's where we had some pretty unsettled weather, a bit of snow included in that as well.
Exactly, yeah. So it's often the wind, which is the key impact with a storm, but we can see big impacts from snow as well. Was it Storm Arwen we had the season before, which brought in really heavy snow as well across northern areas, and power cuts that lasted a long time as well. That was mainly the snow, I think, that brought those impacts.
Then we went on to Storm Henk, which came in January, and then Isha as well, and Jocelyn in January as well. Now, Jocelyn was named by Met Erin, but again, we did have some significant impacts in the UK with some amber warnings. Isha was a big one. We had a red wind warning, so that was a severe feature. Then we actually had a bit of a break. We had, after a very stormy start to the season, the first few months, lots of storms. We then had a bit of a break. It wasn't until the start of April when Kathleen hit, and that wasn't that significant a feature for the UK, again named by Met Erin. But then finally, just recently, Lillian came along at the end of August, and it brought some pretty unseasonable weather. It's fair to say that when we talk about our impacts, there are a few things that we take into account when it comes to issuing our warnings. It's not just the speed of the winds or the strength of the winds and the rainfall. It's also where it's happening and when it's happening.
Exactly.
So the time of year and the time of day. We were relatively lucky with Lillian in as much as the strongest winds, the heaviest rain, a lot of it came overnight or early hours, whereas the bad thing with Lillian was the fact that it came in August when there were a lot of outdoor events. I've seen footage from Creamfields, Leeds Festival, with tents being blown all around. Trees are full of leaf, and so the disruption is going to be greater in the summer months.
If you've got everyone sleeping inside in their nice cosy beds, you're going to see people aren't going to notice the 50-mile-per-hour winds necessarily. They might wake up and see a few trees down on the road. But with Storm Lillian, in the middle of the summer holidays or towards the end of the summer holidays, a lot of people are out camping. We're getting a lot of messages, people, when we name Storm Lillian, saying, I'm currently in a tent, what do I do? And so when people are in a tent, you're not as protected, so the impacts are potentially greater. Hopefully lots of people did either go home early or make sure their tents were well sealed in that case. So it's worth noting, last season we had it was the furthest we got down the list, but it was the frequency that we saw them through autumn, which was quite notable. That's all to do with the weather setup. If you want to know any more about why we had such a stormy season last year, check out our latest deep dive with Aidan and the special guest Will Lang. But we're going to be talking now about the next season, 2024-2025, which starts on the 1st of September.
So very soon, and the names are now live. Should we go through some of those names?
Let's have a look at them.
Let's have a look. So, starting off, so here they are. So we have Ashley, Bert, Connell, Dara, Eowyn, Floris, Gerben, Hugo, Izzy, James, Kaylee, Lewis, Mavis, Nisha, Otja, Poppy, Rafi, Sayuri, Tilly, Vivian and Ren. So a real mix of names because
the list is not just from the Met Office. As you'll see at the top here, Met Erin and KNMI are also responsible for pulling this list together. So we have different names from different meteorological organisations within that list. So some of them, which you may not know how to pronounce, for example, Otja, have come from other meteorological organisations. So it's really important we get this list together. Everyone knows what the list is, how to pronounce everything. So when the time comes to name the storm, we know where we are with it.
Exactly, yeah. Everyone knows exactly where we are going to be. It can cause some confusion if people get a bit excited and think some unsettled weather's necessarily going to be named, and people will start batting the names around already. But this is the list. These are the names. Is your name on the list? Is there someone that you know? Do you know a Gerben? Do you know a Mavis? Is there anyone that you think it's pretty fitting that they've had a storm named after them? Do let us know in the comments. But interestingly, some of the names that we came up with for this list were all to do with the fact that 2024 is the 170th anniversary of the Met Office. So we looked back through our history and found a few people that really stood out and had a significant impact, did a lot for the organisation and for the country, to be honest, and for weather forecasting as a whole.
Yeah, so it's James, Lewis and Mavis. So first of all, we've got James Martin Stagg, who was an incredibly important person. He was responsible for advising General Eisenhower on the weather forecast for the D-Day landings. Now that is something we are incredibly proud of here at the Met Office, and it is a forecast that has gone down as one of the most important forecasts, or the most important forecast the Met Office has ever produced.
Yeah, the weather that they needed in order for a successful D-Day landing was really precise. They needed the full moon as well. There was a lot going on, and it was due to the advice of James Stagg that they postponed the D-Day landings by a day, and really it was the right decision. And I think it was also quite fitting at the time that whilst the weather wasn't completely ideal for the landings, it was just about good enough. But because of that, I think on the other side, they weren't expecting something like it, because it was touch and go whether something could go ahead. But yeah, James Stagg really accurately forecast it, and like you say, one of probably the most important forecast ever produced for the Met Office. Then Lewis, named after Lewis Fry Richardson. Now, he was one of the first people to work out how to use computers to predict the weather, and he was brought into the Met Office to come up with the theory of the numerical weather prediction, the NWP, which we still use now, an NWP of sorts, when it comes to forecasting our weather. The difference between then and now is we now have a supercomputer which does all the incredible calculations, the sums, and produces output which we can then use as meteorologists to work out what the weather's going to do. When Lewis Fry Richardson was coming up with this, it was around 30 years before computers were even invented. So he came up with the idea of these sums, these calculations being carried out very quickly, and lots of them, without a computer. He relied on people to come up with it. But this then led on to the fact that we could have supercomputers and computers helping us predict the weather.
Exactly. It means that we now have a wealth of information to look through to produce more accurate weather forecasts than ever before. And it's a much simpler process in many ways. As a meteorologist, to produce the weather forecast, back in the day, you'd have to draw your charts, do everything by hand, and use a lot of theory, which we still use today, but we have that paired with the numerical weather prediction output from that supercomputer. So yeah, very important guy, Lewis Fry Richardson.
Definitely. And speaking of supercomputers, or computers as a whole, Mavis is named after Mavis Hines.
Yeah, so Mavis then took that numerical weather prediction theory and put it into practice. So they had to use a computer at night, I think, to test this theory out, to prove that it could produce more accurate weather forecasts, or accurate weather forecasts of that. And once they had proved that, that then allowed the Met Office to get the funding to buy their first ever computer to produce those weather forecasts.
Yeah, they had to use it at night, I believe, because it was at the University of Manchester and they were sharing it with people such as Alan Turing.
Yes.
So the same computer they were using, but they managed to make it. And then Mavis Hines worked on, I think, all of the initial supercomputers that we had here at the Met Office. So she did some incredible work and helped the development of the supercomputers, such that we have such a powerful beast nowadays.
Yeah, so it's not a straightforward list that we've got this year. There's some very important characters behind that. There's always some different inspiration that comes out of the list, but here the list again. Is your name on it? Would you like your name to be on the storm list?
Well, you've missed it.
You've missed your chance this year, as it has been finalised, but next year you can always have a go. we take suggestions, don't we?
We do take suggestions. I think a few things worth bearing in mind. So back in the day when we first started the storm naming system, we kept the pattern that they used with hurricane names, and we used to alternate by genders. Whereas we've got rid of that, and it now doesn't alternate by genders, but we have stuck for now with the alphabetical order going starting with Ashley. It does mean the chances of us getting a Rafi, a Wren, pretty slim. That being said, we didn't really think, especially after not last storm season was incredibly stormy, but the previous one, it took until August for us to get any storms.
Yeah.
And we only then had 2. So I think we weren't really, or we've got
to be prepared for the names.
We're always prepared.
We were prepared we could use them, but in the UK we often don't get that far through the list, do we?
Exactly. It's potential, and so maybe one year we'll mix it up and we'll go backwards up the alphabet instead, so that some people have a greater chance of getting their names on.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're a Zach or a Zebediah.
Yeah, so any Zachs at home, don't be disheartened. Send your requests in to get your name on the list. You can find more details about storm naming season on our website, and we'll be doing loads across our social media through the next couple of weeks.
Thank you very much for joining us. I do hope you've found this little look at our 2024-25 storm names and why we name things at all very useful, and we will see you again soon.
Bye-bye.